Okay.
Well, welcome to the fourth in a series of 5 on views of where history is going, with special attention to Christian views. I'm Lee Barrett from Lancaster Theological Seminary, Moravian University on the NB Barchinger campus. That's what it says on my business card. Today, we're having already looked at views that history is declining or that history is progressing. We're going to look at the view that history may be going in cycles. It's circular. Maybe it's spiraling upward, but at least everything recurs. And that view is, well, to preview coming attractions, that's really popular right now, for reasons that we'll talk about. And it does go back to the ancient world. It has roots in the Old Testament itself, particularly in the book of Daniel, where Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts. Actually has a couple of visions. And each of the beasts represents an empire. And the theme is that empires rise and fall, but there's always an empire. That empires have lifespans. And he sees a lion, a hyena, a bear, and a goat. It seemed to me that the goat is a little anomalous, because the other animals are pretty ferocious, but then you got this goat. And they represented, for Daniel, the rise and fall of the empires of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Macedonia, the empire of Alexander the Great, which was the empire under which he was living. And on the horizon, he said there's going to be another animal, another beast. And it turns out he was alluding to the rise of Rome, which was on the horizon at that time. And that same pattern occurs in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, where there are animal imageries of the rise of empires leading up to the empire of Rome, which is portrayed very, very negatively. So it's in the Bible, the sense that empires come and empires go. They have a life cycle. And in the ancient world, beyond the Bible, in Greece, that idea occurred similarly. Plato said that first you have a society of rationality, ruled by wise people, people who are rational, the philosophers. Oh, that sounds like a good idea. And he called that aristocracy, ruled by the best people. And then that degenerates into rule by people who want fame and honor. He called that the oligarchy. And then that declines, and it's taken over by the society ruled by people of wealth, plutocracy, ruled by the rich. And then he concluded that that degenerates into rule by everybody, democracy, which he hated and associated with chaos. And then finally people get fed up with the chaos and tyranny happens, where just some powerful individual steps in and stops the chaos and promotes people of rationality, and then the whole cycle starts again. So he thought that's the way that Athens and Sparta and the other city-states rose and fell. And that notion sort of makes some, I think it has some intuitive power to people. Because it's like the cycles of the seasons. You know, winter gives way to spring, and spring to summer, and summer to autumn. And then it's winter again, and the whole thing starts over. So the notion was human history and human society is like nature. It has seasons, as does the human body. We are born, we flourish, we grow, we prosper, we start to decline, we get sick, our pancreas starts to go, I'm sorry. And then finally, the end is in sight. And then it starts all over again with a new generation. So that has been a recurrent theme, that history and societies are like the human body and like the seasons. And the Old Testament, the New Testament, And Plato and a lot of people following him conceptualized that and codified it. And then it gained new popularity in the early 19th century because dramatic things had happened in European society and history in a way that had never happened before. The two big ones were the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Probably the French Revolution even more so. Because it looked like the order that had lasted for centuries, the feudal order of aristocracy and monarchy, and the hegemony of the Catholic Church was shattered. That things are not always the same, that things change. And then they looked at history and said, oh yeah, this has happened before. Roman Empire collapsed. The Holy Roman Empire collapsed. Byzantine Empire collapsed. And we're collapsing. So people like Thomas Carlyle claimed that there was a necessary cycle in human history where a culture would be centralized, governed by aristocracy, probably by a king or queen, maybe an emperor, and then power would get progressively centralized in the state to the point where it became oppressive. And he cited like Louis XIV, the guy who said, the state is me, l'état c'est moi, in France, where the central government becomes too powerful to the point where people can't take it anymore and revolt. And then you have the French Revolution and the guillotine and the Reign of Terror. And that leads to chaos and murder and mass disruption. And then people get tired of the chaos and they revert to having a strong central government again, a king, a monarch. And Carlyle thought that pattern just recurs again and again throughout history. Strong leader, centralized government, gets oppressive, people can't take it, they revolt, then there's chaos, and then they go back to a centralized government. In the 20th century, other cyclical views of history developed as it became clear that history was exhibiting some strange patterns with World War I, the Great Depression, technologization. People had a sense that things are changing, and so they looked at history to see, is there any guidance? Can we make sense out of this? Has this ever happened before? And people concluded, yes, it has. The most notable and most depressing was the German philosopher, historian in the early 20th century, Oswald Spengler, who wrote a book called The Decline of the West. And he claimed that every civilization, every culture, grows, expands, prospers, reaches a climax, and then starts to deteriorate and decline. He thought that was true of the civilization of Western Europe. It had been growing and expanding and prospering ever since the Middle Ages. He thought it had reached maturity, and now it was in its senescence and was going to decline and disappear. And something new would arise. He thought it was probably China. He might not have been wrong. But that was a very depressing word in the early 20th century. And he thought that the reason for this is that civilizations, if they're successful, become prosperous. People have more money, more opportunities, and then that prosperity leads to self-indulgence. People become more selfish and less civic-minded because they're prospering, to the point where there's no civic virtue, no concern for the commonwealth, everybody's looking out for their own interests, and then the civilization starts to collapse. So he thought that was what was going on in Europe and in North America. He was writing this in the 1920s, that the civilization had become so prosperous in spite of World War I, that, well, actually World War I was a symptom of decline, that people were becoming selfish, egocentric, greedy, and as a result, the collapse of the society was on the horizon. And that book made a big, big splash. especially in an era like the 1930s, where things looked like they were going downhill fast. People looked to Spengler and said, he was right. His only word of hope was that after a civilization collapses, something else will rise from the ashes, that there will be a new generation that will create a new civilization. But he thought that Western civilization had pretty much run its course. And then that spawned a lot of different cyclical views of history, which I'll just throw out a lot. There's going to be a lot of material here, but because there were a lot of different theories of what is causing the cycles in human history. And by the 1960s, there were probably a dozen different theories, all of them favoring a cyclical view, that we're not making progress, but we're not going backwards, we're just going in circles. One was Arthur Schlesinger, father and son, senior and junior, whose heyday was probably the 1960s, one of the most renowned intellectuals, historians in the 60s, American. And he proposed that the cycles go like this, that in any society, there is a dynamic towards liberalization, by which he meant the extension of human rights, the extension of democracy, the extension of the right to vote, the extension of toleration for different opinions, the growth of individualism, and then somewhat like Spengler, but he was a little less pessimistic. He thought that finally that individualism reaches a peak where it's the war of everybody against everybody else. That there are too many rights, there's too much individuality, there's too much attention to minority groups, and then everything starts to fall apart. And people begin to long for a strong central government that will take away their rights for the sake of solidarity and stability. So the cycle was, first you have liberalism, then that starts to make people crazy because everything's too individualistic, and people long for a cohesive society in which everybody believes the same thing, so individual rights get curtailed, and it's a return to the good old days. Imagine good old days when things were stable, people got along with each other, there was no dissension, and there was a strong central government to keep individuals in check. So that was Schlesinger, and he was writing that in the 60s, and actually both Schlesingers, father and son, and that caught on with both parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats. Said, yeah, we've got to watch out for that. We want to extend rights and democracy and toleration, but we don't want to do it too fast, and we don't want to do it too intensively, or else people will get crazy and everything will fall apart. But his was just one of the cyclical views of history. By the way, his Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s studied opinion was, you can't do much about it. It's going to happen. It's always happened this way. There's a movement towards decentralization and freedom and individuality, and then that triggers a reaction towards collectivism. So that you see that in every society throughout history. So he cautioned that you can try to fight it, but you're probably not going to work. And then there were other theories, sort of like Spengler's, that proposed that the problem is you start with a society where people are patriotic, and they subject their own self-interest to the good of the whole. And because they're patriotic, they work hard. Because they work hard, they make money. Because they make money, they're prosperous. And as they get prosperous, they get more materialistic and less idealistic. They used to be inspired by ideals of justice and patriotism, but then that gets eclipsed by personal well-being. So this view was that idealism leads to prosperity, because people work hard, and then that leads to materialism, and then that leads to selfishness, and that leads to a collapse of the society, and then the whole thing starts over, maybe in another culture. And in the 60s, that too was very popular. The notion that we're not as idealistic as we used to be. Or think of more recently books like The Greatest Generation, that would lionize the generation of World War II, and then conclude, and look around at us now. We're all selfish and materialistic. We're not self-sacrificial like the people who fought World War II. And there are lots of other theories of the cyclical view of history. One that was poo-pooed for a while, but now it's back, was that of Malthus, an economist, who in the 19th century had proposed that population growth is exponential. Take two human beings, put them in a family, they might have 4 children. So every generation, there's a population explosion. There's an exponential increase. But productive capacity, particularly in regard to food, grows arithmetically. It doesn't grow at the same rate as the population. So that sooner or later, there's not going to be enough food to support the population, in which case that civilization collapses and a new civilization will be born. And given the Industrial Revolution and some decrease in deaths of children, infant mortality, decrease in that, better medical care, it looked like he was right, that the population was growing exponentially, and the food supply was not. It turned out that the Industrial Revolution, for a while, and agro-industry did provide enough food for people. But now there's some speculation that those days may be over, and maybe Malthus was right, and the population is outrunning its food supply, and so we will descend into a period of chaos, warfare for scarce resources, trade wars for food, hot wars to get food, and our civilization will deteriorate and collapse, and then hopefully another civilization, maybe somewhere else, maybe in Asia, maybe in Africa, will arise to take our place. By the way, all of these are depressing, if you haven't noticed, because all of them imply that we're on the cusp of the decline, or that the decline has already started. A more modern modification of that is that industrialization and technologization is responsible for overpopulation. That life is better, life is easier, people are living longer, and that eventually will lead to overpopulation and the inability of our culture to sustain itself, and therefore to its collapse. And then one of the ones of my favorite, just because it's kind of weird, but intriguing, was developed in the 1950s by a historian named Emil Dagio, who claimed that history is like a chess game, in which the big pieces fight to a stalemate in the center of the chessboard. And then some sneaky little pawns on the side come in and they decide the game. So the power always shifts from central powers who are slugging it out and killing each other, and therefore declining in power. And then the power gravitates to the edge of the board. So let me give some examples of what he thought. He thought that, for example, in the 16th century and into the 17th, the major players were France and the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, including Spain and Austria, and that they fought to a standstill in Central Europe. Nobody won. They exhausted their resources. And then, a little more on the periphery, other powers arose, namely Britain, the Netherlands, and the beginnings of Germany. And they began to dominate as France and the Holy Roman Empire declined. And then in the 19th century, the game expanded even further. Napoleon made a vain effort to reestablish France as the hegemon, but he failed. And so power gravitated not just to Britain, but even beyond it to the United States and to Russia that had been on the periphery. So it was like Russia and the United States were watching the game, sitting in the wings, and everybody was destroying themselves. And then it came time for their day in the sun. And then after that, he claimed that the board expanded even further so that the major players became players. One player who wasn't even noticed until the 20th century, Japan. Japan and the United States as being the main players, and a resurgent China. I'm not endorsing that, but it was, some folk have thought maybe that's true, that central powers fight each other to a standstill, exhaust their resources, and then players, nations that nobody had ever thought of before as being powerful, rise and decide the game, and they become the hegemons until the whole thing starts over again. So that was, and what's interesting about that is it put most of the emphasis on political ambitions and even military ambitions, unlike some of the other theories. A more recent one, and it's kind of simple, was proposed in the 1980s by historian Paul Kennedy, who claimed that it's in the nature of nations and empires to try to extend their power. That everybody, just as it's in the nature of individuals to try to extend your power, social power, economic power. And what that leads to is what he called imperial overreach, that nations and empires push themselves to have more power than they can actually sustain. They want more territory. They want, maybe they want the Ukraine or Greenland or who knows what. And when they do so, they actually stretch themselves beyond their resources to sustain anything. And as a result, they begin to decline and collapse. And he thought that that was happening with the United States and with the Soviet Union and then Russia, that both powers were overreaching, were going to therefore enter a period of decline, just as the British Empire did. He thought that's what happened to the British Empire. That was his test case. It overextended itself. It wanted India. It wanted Australia. It had wanted the American colonies, but couldn't hold on to them. And so finally it had so many overseas commitments that its economy could not sustain it, and the whole thing began to deteriorate. So we thought that we and...
Can I interrupt you for just
Sure.
a second and give you new batteries?
Yeah, I thought something had gone wrong.
Let me just have your pen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, I thought I had stopped hearing.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Good. Is it? Yeah, now I can.
We're good.
Now I can hear it. Yeah. So we lost a couple of cyclical views, but they'll cycle back. And there are other economic views of rise and decline. Most of them have to do with overexpansion. The corporations are like nations in that they need to expand, they need to grow in order to live. They can't be happy with the status quo. And sooner or later, they invest too much in their expansion and they start to deteriorate. But that's a more economic version of Kennedy. And then finally, there's the simple one that every society just becomes too smug, too self-satisfied. I often teach in Denmark, and we go to Denmark a lot. And as you fly into Denmark, the airport, there's emblazoned in giant letters on the main hangar that says, Denmark, the happiest place on earth, because it usually wins those polls about.
That just happened, and they in fact won the poll.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, it just happened this week.
Okay, I didn't know that. They had lost it for a while to Norway, and occasionally to Finland, but it's always a Scandinavian country.
They were the top 3 this week.
Yep, yep. I have a friend who lives in Denmark and said it's not that we're the happiest place on earth, we're just the smuggest place on earth, as you can see from the sign in the airport. And then went on to say, and that will be our decline. That's our weakness. We will get too self-satisfied, we'll get complacent, we'll stop trying to improve ourselves, and our civilization will collapse. I'm not endorsing that view, but it's a simple one, and you hear that in political rhetoric a lot. We used to be virtuous, but now we've become self-oriented. Now we used to be strong, and now we're weak. We used to be courageous, and now we're cowardly. We used to be just, and now we're not. And you get that actually from both political parties and everything in between. So that's the major cyclical views of history. Many of them have a secular guise now. They're political, they're economic, they're cultural, but they have their roots way back in ancient Greece with Plato and with the Old Testament. So before I go into another view of history, I'd like to pause there and ask for responses, questions. Do any of them sound plausible?
Yes.
See a show of hands. How many would say, yeah, I think things do go in cycles for nations?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh my goodness. That's as close to consensus as we'll ever get. Yeah.
I have one comment in that maybe in the recent past and nowadays there seems to be a kind of a corollary to the overpopulation worries, and that is, the so-called pronatalism, that there's not enough births, although that's kind of a focused and egocentric view of some countries.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a view that's not cyclical, based on that's industrialized, technologized countries are losing population. At the same time, they're trying to curtail immigration, which is alarming. And then but the footnote to that is, and a lot of the work is being done by robots. So the people who are being born, what are they going to do when IT and robotics are much more sophisticated and do much more of the work that Homo sapiens used to do? And the projection is there'll be a lot of unemployed people, a lot of poverty, a lot of folk who are just unhappy that their life is meaningless because they have nothing to do, and they're going to be angry.
They're going to take care of the 10,000 baby boomers who turn 65 every day.
Yeah, yeah.
They're the ones who are going to be left without caregivers because of all the immigrants who are being turned away, because that's one of the main sources of help for those people.
Exactly, yeah.
They're working on robots for that.
Yeah, I guess there are. Yes, they are.
I think I saw a hand, yeah.
Just a funny question. So I've heard it said that if we don't learn history, we're doomed to repeat it. But if it's cyclical, what's the point?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, good, yeah, because there the point is, whether you know history or not, you're going to repeat it. And there's not much you can do about it. These dynamics are just built into the human species. And as societies, these patterns will recur. Yes, so the possibility of not repeating it, of not being doomed to repeat it, is, in these views, negligible. All you can do is try to maybe mitigate the disasters that might happen. But it is interesting to me to follow on that comment about underpopulation, that for the first time in human history, at least for the developed nations, that is a real possibility. You know, Japan, USA, even China now, and certainly Europe, underpopulation. But that still doesn't mitigate the problem of unemployment. I mean, in the past, underpopulation was a good thing because wages would go up. Not enough people to do the work, wages go up. The people who are around want more money. But this is the first time where there could be underpopulation plus unemployment and no prospects for employment. So folks who go that route, they're the most depressing of all, because they are the dystopian folk that we're headed for apocalypse, and there's not much we can do about it. Yeah.
Even with underpopulation, as they say it, the destruction of like our farmland or our ability to grow our own food might be some of our demise, even if the population's lower, because if you can't grow the food, eventually there'll be a food, if there's no way to grow food. Like in our area, the farmland's going faster than lightning, and
Yeah, going towards enterprises that are more lucrative.
right.
And even in the production of food, I mean, this is a global phenomenon. I read a lot of doomsday stuff because I'm depressed. A lot of farmland has been shifted to meat production, growing grain for cattle, rather than food that humans can eat that would be easier to produce and more like beans and rice. So that all over the world, some small farms that were used for growing beans and rice have now been taken over by like McDonald's for grain production for cattle. And that's much more expensive and not as efficient as growing the rice and beans in the first place. You need a lot more land to grow a hamburger. Well, I used to grow hamburgers to get enough meat for a hamburger than you do for several helpings of rice. Yeah.
Thinking of relatively recent history, for many, many decades, Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of Russia. I wonder how much that motivates Putin in his desire to recontrol Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I think it does. I'm no Soviet or Russian Ukrainian expert, but I think he's been pretty clear about that. As was Hitler. I mean, that's why he wanted oil, but more than that, he wanted grain from the Ukraine, because it was the breadbasket of Europe. So that's an example. And cyclical views of history often cite that throughout European history, folk have always wanted to get control of the major agriculturally productive areas. Napoleon did, well, even before that, Peter the Great did, Catherine the Great did, Napoleon did, and then of course Hitler did, and now Putin does. So there the theme is history always repeats itself. And history and that desire to have control of the grain productive areas of Eurasia is always frustrated by the Russian winter, which destroyed Napoleon's army, destroyed Hitler, and it at least put a halt to Putin. So again, they say, runs in cycles.
Now, some of the authors that you've been citing, have they also pointed to, shall we say, third world examples? I mean, cyclicality in Latin America and in Africa and Central Asia and places like that?
Yeah, they do. Especially Arnold Toynbee, who wrote, you may remember, he wrote this massive history of everything in the 1940s and 1950s. It was even sold in Macy's and the ancestors of Walmart. So it was widely read. And he did claim that the cycles he saw in European and Western history were evident in the history of China and India. He didn't deal with Africa much at all, but he thought at least major prosperous civilizations like China and India from the ancient world until now exhibited the same patterns. And that all of them have periods of prosperity and periods of decline, and sometimes periods of being taken over by another civilization, like the Aztecs being taken over by the Spaniards, and collapse and something new arises from the ashes. The only optimistic thing about this is something else will arise and then go through the same cycle. It's sort of like the myth of Sisyphus. You roll the rock up the hill, you get to the top, and the rock rolls back down. And then you got to roll it back up again. And you just do that forever and ever. The cycles continue indefinitely. Or in Haiti, there's a proverb. What do you see when you struggle to the top of the mountain? The answer is another mountain. So it just goes on and on and on. So that a final resting place, attaining utopia, or love, peace, and justice on earth, is not going to happen. It's not inevitable progress. It is growth, maturity, and then decline, just as it is in an individual life. Yeah?
Well, I'm just wondering, given human nature, how much consolation is it that something else will rise again if it's not us? You know?
Yeah. Well, that's the big question.
Yeah.
Does that make you happy? That our way of life will disappear, but there'll be something to replace it.
So in other words, you're saying that Mel Gibson was prescient with Road Warriors? I mean, is that what we're gonna be eventually?
That's part of it. Yeah. No, the Road Warrior phenomenon with Mel Gibson, that's going to happen, but that cloud has a silver lining in that some new civilization will grow out of the Road Warrior culture. Thank you for bringing that up, because as we think about where's history going, there was, starting with the 1980s, that's still going on, a lot of dystopia movies. Like, civilization is going to collapse, and it's not going to be pretty. And so Mel Gibson's probably the most prolific in that regard, with his Road Warrior movies. And then one that didn't get as much attention called Apocalypto, which was about the collapse of Mayan civilization. In fact, everything he's done is sort of about the collapse of a civilization. Well, except for Braveheart, where hero gets killed, but something's going to rise, Scotland's going to rise from the ashes. Anything else?
How about a country like Switzerland? It seems to be not in a cyclical behavior for 500, 600 years.
Yeah. I don't know what they would say about Switzerland, which has remained neutral, sort of above the fray, and prosperous for about 500 years. Maybe that's the way to go, just opt out of the struggle for power, and just make good watches. Now they're heavily reliant upon technology as their industry. So they could be in trouble eventually if the road warrior phenomenon does happen and there's nobody around outside Switzerland to buy their watches. Yeah.
One of the features of Switzerland is, from an economic standpoint, it's much more expensive to live there than the nations surrounding it.
Yeah, which tends to keep people out,
Yeah.
curtail immigration.
But if you, my daughter lives in Switzerland, but if you work in Switzerland, it's hard to get a residency there, okay? But you, when you work there, you make enough money to cover whatever's happening in their economy, plus their medicine and stuff is all part of your taxes, like they have socialized
Right.
medicine and all. But it's kind of, it's hard to get in there, but if you're living in that society, it's fine. Like, the people that live there have the money to spend on
Right.
this stuff.
So that's a
Which
combination of keeping the population down by not being very generous towards immigrants, having a fairly high standards for what they have to do to be naturalized, and maintaining prosperity, but high taxes, which is the pattern in Scandinavia too.
Just another little comment, either the New York Times or the Washington Post yesterday had an article about a growing number of people who are looking at that manifesto that Ted Kaczynski, is that his name, wrote, and they're saying, you know, in this paragraph, he had a point, and in this paragraph, he had a point. So I guess there's no longer universal, well, there's scorn about his
Methods.
his outcome,
Yeah.
but his reasoning is seen in a more tolerant light.
That's interesting, because in most of human history, well, I'm not versed in all human history, not even close, but in the parts I know, often cultures have been very progress-minded, like, we're going to get better. The Roman Empire was like that. We're going to expand, we're going to have more territory, more slaves, it's going to be great. But there were always naysayers saying, nah, this is going to explode in our face. But they were always regarded as crazy. Or even a generation ago, folk who said that the United States, as being the world's strongest power, is not going to last forever. Well, those folk were dismissed as nuts, crackpots on the fringe, when many of the things they worried about seemed to be worth worrying about. By the way, I'm not advocating for the Unabomber. That is not the solution. But that would be a symptom of a civilization in decline, when people get very angry, very anxious, and start to act in crazy ways. Okay, I'm going to just introduce the last one, which is probably conceptually the easiest one of all. And it's increasingly popular. And history isn't going anywhere. It's not going down. It's not going up. It's not progressing. It's not regressing. It's not going in cycles. It's just flat. No one quite knows who said this first. It may have been Toynbee himself who said this: history is just one damn thing after another. And that's often coupled with the notion that what generates historical change is not anything intrinsic to a culture or a civilization. It's not anything in the civilization's DNA. It's external accidental factors. Like, what if you get hit by an asteroid? What if there's the bubonic plague? What if there's another ice age? As there was a little ice age in Europe in the 17th century. That made everybody crazy. So it's like unforeseeable accidents, not cycles and not long-term trends that determine the outcome of history. And sometimes it's just the decisions of leaders. And you can't predict what those are going to be. Sometimes they're good. Some years you don't have hurricanes, and some years you have hurricanes, and it's bad. Sometimes leaders are wise and make good decisions, sometimes they don't. You just never know.
COVID-19 comes to mind.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was the big one that happened recently. And even small scale, forest fires in California, measles, you just never know what's going to strike. And they'll say that has governed the history of the earth. Think of the dinosaurs. And probably, I think the majority opinion is asteroids, changing the climate and making them non-adaptable to a new situation. So you just never know what's going to happen. So history isn't going up in general, it's not going down. It's governed by accidents, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So things might work out for a while, might not. But overall, the most you can do is try to cope as best you can with whatever fate or providence throws your way, which is unforeseeable. Just try to adapt. If an asteroid hits, try to adjust. If there's a COVID outbreak, try to deal with it. And you never know if it's going to work or not. And that view has been, in some eras, very strong in Christianity. Martin Luther, pretty much the godfather of Protestantism, said that history is just like being on a ship sailing to a destination. Only it springs a big, massive leak and it can't move. So it's not going to get to the destination. All you can do is man the pumps and try to pump the water out and maybe get the lifeboats ready. And that's all history is until God decides to terminate history and there will be the end of everything and maybe a new heaven and a new earth. They thought for the time being, we're just trying to keep our heads above water. We're just treading water, we're not making any progress, and maybe we can tread water a little longer so that the church can survive and more souls will be saved. He said, that's it, that's all we can hope for. So it's a very meager hope. And that view that history really is just unforeseeable ups and downs has, that's also gained steam, I think, in the American population. Maybe because of COVID and some other unforeseen things. I mean, people really didn't foresee even the collapse of the Soviet Union. Maybe long term it was hypothesized, but when it actually happened and the whole world order changed, that was a shock. It required a lot of economic and international relations adjustment. And then COVID's been, I think, the next big one. AI and the growth of robotics is another thing nobody really knows how to cope with. Maybe some of you are in teaching or other occupations, and I keep getting emails from various companies about how to spot student papers that have been written by robots. I started to get those about 5 years ago. And then there were advertisements about how to get software to detect a student a robot-generated paper. And then emails about how to block the detection of a robot-generated paper. And then finally, how to use robots to write your own books. So, I mean, there are instances where people's dissertations were robot generated, IA generated. And I always love those little things that pop up on your screen every once in a while that's to prove you're not a robot. You know, I am not a robot, and then you have to determine how many motorcycles are there on the screen, you know, and you wonder, well, if you can see the fender of a motorcycle, does that count? So there are things nobody's anticipated or could anticipate. So I think that sense of we just don't know what the future's going to be is increasing. And rather than making people depressed, like we know it's going downhill, that just makes people anxious. Like something's happening, we're not quite sure what, but we got to be on guard. So some social psychologists have said there's been a decrease in mass depression, but an increase in mass anxiety, because people just don't know what the future is going to be for their children, their families, themselves, their nation, their culture. It seems very, very uncertain. So that's the history's just an erratic up. It's like the stock market. It's just, except it doesn't generally go up. It's just up and down, up and down, up and down. If you look at your retirement funds, as I have learned not to do daily, see, you know, it can go up several $1,000s in one day and then down several more $1,000s the next. So for some views, history's like that. It just oscillates with no rhyme or reason, and nobody knows where it's going. Get responses to that view. Anybody want, yeah?
I think probably the negative view is that things can happen so much faster now, and I think I said this opinion last time, than earlier in history because of rockets and computers, and so we could be more prone to something disastrous happening, and I apologize for saying that.
No, actually, one of the historians, Paul Kennedy, said that if there are cycles, and he thought there were, they're accelerated. And he said it's the microchip that did it. He said it used to take these cycles hundreds of years to happen, and now it's going to take them just decades, maybe just years.
Well, the instant news. Everybody walks around with their phone,
Yep.
a small computer, take a picture, and it's flashed around the world in microseconds. Whereas before, you'd see an event, you'd write an article in a paper, it'd get published eventually, and it would slowly circulate.
Right.
And it would take months to get that information around. Now it's instant.
Right.
And it's changing the way we look at things, the way we react.
Right. And that instant communication of information and opinions and interpretations,
Yes.
which can happen, as you said, in a split second. Whatever is happening in history, that's going to accelerate it, because public opinion can change overnight, depending on what's being communicated in the media.
Who's communicating the most, the loudest?
Right, and the fastest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who gets it out there first?
Who says it the most often? I'm thinking about the how lies can be repeated sufficiently so that people believe it's the truth. I mean, they're now managing the management of the media, not just the speed of it, but being able to manage it so that the population hears the news so many times that they believe something is true, even though it may not be supported by fact.
Yeah. This is a bit of a tangent, but there is a cultural move often to, and this is part of a cyclical view, to look back at ancient Rome, particularly the transition from the Republic to the Empire. It was triggered largely by Caesar. and solidified under Augustus. You know, you could go from having Rome as a republic to Rome as essentially a dictatorship. And so folk are looking at Rome to see, is this happening again? And one of the things that's mentioned is that if it is happening again, it's happening much faster than it did in the Roman Empire. Because in the Roman Empire, opinions and information were disseminated by speeches, like Cicero. You know, and only a few thousand people, maybe only a few hundred, could hear it. And then it had to be written down by somebody, copied by a scribe, hand done, and disseminated that way. So there weren't many people, and it would take a long time to write that stuff down and get it out there. So there weren't many people who were actually quickly aware of what was being said by anybody. So in other words, there was a real lag with the news and the formation of public opinion. But now that can happen instantaneously. So whereas it took maybe a stretch of 200, 250 years for the Roman Republic to disappear, essentially, and become a dictatorship, now it can happen overnight because of the speed of communication.
And back at that time, there's a whole lot of people that could not read or write. They had to
Right.
rely on
Right.
on speeches.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And people are still wondering, how did the news get out? Like, how did people know what Cicero had said? Because he was the one who was warning people about the rise of dictators. And one hypothesis is, well, somebody heard the speech in person, wrote it down as best they could, and made some copies of it. That takes a long time. And then there would be local gatherings in people's houses to have somebody read it to them. Because also, many people couldn't read. In fact, the vast majority of the population. So they had to hear it. And so public opinion couldn't change very quickly at all. It would take years. But now, could happen in days. Yeah?
I don't think he was talking about technology, but I think there's a Mark Twain quote about a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth gets its shoes on.
Yeah, exactly. And now that's very, very easy. Yeah. So to conclude this, I want to always try to end on a happy note. At least in the cyclical view, even if things collapse, civilization will start over. That Mel Gibson's dystopia will give rise to a new civilization, which will flourish for a while, and then there will be road warrior time again. And the view that history doesn't really exhibit a pattern, but is just a series of accidents that could have been otherwise, depending on natural catastrophes, political decisions. That holds open the hope that maybe the meteorite won't strike, and maybe there won't be another pandemic, and maybe political leaders will make some good decisions. At least that's possible. Whether how likely it is, I'll leave to you. But I think both these views, the cyclical one and the history is just a bunch of accidental ups and downs, are gaining strength over the views that there's an inevitable decline or there is inevitable progress. Just my last reflection. I spent my young adulthood in the 60s and 70s. It was hard in those days to find somebody who didn't think that there was going to be inevitable progress. They might doubt as to what the progress was, or difference of opinion, what would count as progress, but there were very few people who said, no, it's going downhill, or it's going in cycles, or it's flat. But that belief in inevitable progress, I think, has taken huge hits, and is not part of our general cultural ambiance anymore. Okay, so next week will be the last one, and then all mysteries will be revealed, and I'll tell you the truth about what's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you.